At 3:02 p.m. on April 5, 2010, the steel teeth of a longwall shearer, deep inside the Upper Big Branch mine, struck sandstone. The spark it created was not an accident. It was the predictable ignition point in a volatile system, the result of countless procedural lapses. The forensic record shows how a single spark became a 2-mile-long propagating disaster and why it was entirely preventable. April 5, 2010. Shift change had occurred at 7 that morning. 200 miners descended into the Upper Big Branch South Mine Complex in Montco, Raleigh County, West Virginia. Most had been underground for hours. The air tasted of diesel and rock dust. The ventilation fans hummed at a constant pitch. The longwall shearer, a hulking piece of machinery designed to shave coal from the face in continuous passes, ran without incident. For the men working the headgate section, this was routine. Benny Willingham operated equipment near the longwall. Josh Napper was a roof bolter, securing the mine's ceiling with steel pins. Corey Davis ran shuttle cars that moved coal from the face to the conveyor belt. Gary Quarles was a section foreman, responsible for crew safety and production targets. Edward Dean Jones worked ventilation controls. Each man had a task. Each task was ordinary. The mine itself was not. Upper Big Branch had been cited for thousands of safety violations over the previous decade. Federal inspectors documented inadequate ventilation. Methane monitors were disabled. Rock dust, a non-combustible material used to coat tunnel walls and prevent coal dust explosions, was applied inconsistently or not at all. Management prioritized production tonnage over compliance. When inspectors arrived, a warning system allowed crews to conceal hazards temporarily. This was not negligence by omission, it was negligence by design. At 3:02 p.m., the longwall shearer's cutting teeth had worn down. Dulled bits created friction. Friction created heat. Heat, in a tunnel where methane had accumulated to explosive concentration, created ignition. The spark lasted a fraction of a second. The methane cloud surrounding the shearer ignited immediately. The flame front expanded at subsonic speed, consuming oxygen and raising pressure. Methane burns hot, over 1,900 degrees, but the blast itself would have been survivable if it had remained localized. It did not remain localized. Because the mine's ventilation system was inadequate, methane had accumulated in pockets throughout the workings. Because rock dusting had been neglected, the tunnel walls and floors were coated in pure coal dust. Coal dust is not inert, it is a Class A explosive. When disturbed by an initial blast wave, it becomes airborne. When airborne and mixed with oxygen in the right concentration, it detonates. The methane ignition disturbed the coal dust. The coal dust exploded. What began as a small fire became a deflagration event, a pressure wave traveling faster than the speed of sound, propagating through miles of interconnected tunnels. The blast moved through the headgate, the longwall section, the conveyor belt entries, and every auxiliary tunnel downstream. It destroyed ventilation controls. It shredded brattice curtains designed to direct airflow. It generated carbon monoxide in lethal concentrations. It consumed the oxygen supply, and it killed instantly. The physics of a coal dust explosion are well understood. When a methane ignition creates a pressure wave, it lifts accumulated dust from surfaces. The dust particles remain suspended in air for seconds. If the concentration is between 0.1 and 2 kilograms per cubic meter, and if an ignition source is still present, the dust detonates. The resulting blast is not a single event, it is a cascading series of explosions, each one triggered by the pressure wave of the last. At Upper Big Branch, 79% of 1,803 dust samples collected after the disaster were not in compliance with federal standards. That number is not an abstraction, it means the mine was primed to explode. Every tunnel, every crosscut, every conveyor belt entry, the only missing variable was ignition. The shearer provided it. The first explosion occurred at the coalface. Witnesses who survived, there were only 2, reported a flash of light, a roar, and then darkness. The mine's electrical grid failed instantly. Emergency lighting activated in some sections, in others, nothing. The blast wave moved at supersonic speed through the longwall section. It traveled down the main conveyor belt entry, where coal dust had accumulated in thick layers. Each new section of tunnel added fuel. The pressure wave grew stronger. By the time it reached the intake air shaft, over 2 miles from the ignition point, the overpressure was sufficient to blow out steel ventilation doors, weighing hundreds of pounds. On the surface, the explosion was audible. Workers near the portal heard a muffled thump. The power failed. The ventilation fans stopped. Dust and smoke began pouring from the exhaust shaft. At 3:27 p.m., 25 minutes after the initial spark, the mine superintendent called 911. Underground, the environment had become incompatible with life. Carbon monoxide concentrations exceeded 10,000 parts per million in some areas. The permissible exposure limit is 50. Methane levels remained explosive. Structural supports had collapsed in multiple sections. The ventilation system, which in a compliant mine would have diluted methane and cleared smoke, was destroyed. 29 men were still underground. Some died in the initial blast. Others were killed by the pressure wave as it propagated through tunnels. A few survived the explosion but succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning in the minutes that followed. The gas is odorless. It binds to hemoglobin with 240 times the affinity of oxygen. Once inhaled at high concentration, unconsciousness occurs within seconds. Death follows. By the time the mine's emergency response plan was activated, there was nothing left to respond to but the recovery of bodies. Mine rescue teams mobilized within hours. Federal regulations require coal mines to maintain trained rescue teams on standby. Massey Energy operated its own teams. The West Virginia Office of Miners' Health, Safety and Training dispatched additional crews. The U.S. Mine Safety and Health Administration sent personnel and equipment. By nightfall on April 5th, rescue operations were underway. But they were not rescue operations, they were recovery operations. The first teams entered the mine at 11 p.m. They carried gas detectors, self-contained breathing apparatus, and emergency medical equipment. The detectors immediately registered lethal atmospheric concentrations. Carbon monoxide exceeded safe limits throughout the intake. Methane remained at explosive levels in isolated pockets. Structural instability made every step a calculated risk. The rescuers wore full-face respirators. The air inside those masks tasted sterile, metallic. Outside the masks, nothing was sterile. The smell of burned coal clung to everything. Rock dust coated their suits within minutes. Their headlamps cut narrow cones of light through smoke that hung in the tunnels like fog. Progress was measured in feet per hour. Rescue teams advanced slowly, testing air quality, shoring up collapsed sections, and searching for survivors. The mine's layout was complex. Over 60 miles of tunnels spread across multiple levels. Debris blocked key passages. Ventilation had to be re-established section by section before teams could safely proceed. Each tunnel looked the same. Black walls, low ceilings, steel rails embedded in the floor. The only variation was the damage. In some sections, the blast had peeled steel doors from their hinges. In others, the pressure wave had compressed ventilation, ducting into twisted sculptures. Conveyor belts had melted. Timber supports had splintered. Families gathered at the mine portal. They waited in silence. Some held photographs. Others prayed. The West Virginia governor, Joe Manchin, arrived and spoke to the press. He used the word miracle to describe the possibility of finding survivors. No miracles occurred. The first body was recovered on April 6th, then a second, then 4 more. By April 9th, 25 bodies had been located. 4 miners remained missing, trapped in the deepest section of the mine where methane concentrations remained too high for safe entry. Rescue teams withdrew. They waited for ventilation to improve. It took another day. On April 10th, the final 4 bodies were found. Governor Manchin made the announcement. 29 miners, no survivors beyond the 2 who had been near the mine portal at the time of the blast. The recovery phase lasted 5 days. Every shift was documented. Every body was treated with procedural respect. Coroners conducted field examinations. Forensic teams photographed the scene. Federal investigators began cataloging evidence. The mine, which had operated continuously for years, was sealed, and the investigation began. The U.S. Mine Safety and Health Administration opened a formal investigation on April 6th. The West Virginia Office of Miners' Health, Safety and Training conducted a parallel inquiry. Both agencies deployed inspectors, engineers, and forensic analysts. The goal was not to assign blame, that would come later, but to establish the physical sequence of events and identify the root causes. The work took months. Investigators re-entered the mine in controlled phases. They mapped the blast trajectory using scorch marks on tunnel walls. They analyzed the metallurgy of damaged equipment. They reconstructed the ventilation system's pre-blast configuration using company records and physical remnants. The findings were damning. Investigators documented the worn cutting teeth on the longwall shearer. Metallurgical analysis confirmed they had struck sandstone, creating the ignition spark. This was the primary ignition source, but it was not the primary failure. The primary failure was systemic. Ventilation records showed the mine's air circulation was insufficient to dilute methane. Federal standards require a minimum airflow rate based on the mine's size and methane liberation rate. Upper Big Branch did not meet that standard. Air samples taken in the weeks before the disaster showed methane concentrations approaching the lower explosive limit in multiple sections. No corrective action was taken. The ventilation plan itself was flawed. The mine used a complex network of air shafts, fans, and brattice curtains to direct airflow. But the system was designed for a smaller operation. As production expanded, airflow did not. Methane pockets formed in low-lying areas where air circulation was weakest. The company knew this. Internal memos referenced methane detection events. The response was to disable or relocate monitors, not to fix the ventilation. Rock dusting records were equally non-compliant. Federal regulations require coal dust to be coated with pulverized limestone at a ratio sufficient to render it non-explosive. The standard is 65% incombustible content by weight. Post-blast dust samples showed 79% of locations tested fell below that threshold. This was not random variation, it was systematic neglect. Rock dusting is labor-intensive. It requires dedicated crews and equipment. It slows production. Massey Energy had reduced rock dusting schedules to minimize downtime. When inspectors arrived, crews were instructed to dust visible areas only. Back sections, where the explosion propagated most violently, remained untreated. Internal documents revealed that Massey Energy management had been warned repeatedly. MSHA inspectors issued citations. State regulators issued orders. Miners themselves filed complaints. The company's response was to implement a dual book system, one set of records for inspectors, another for internal use. When citations were issued, the company paid fines and continued operating without remediation. Kevin Strickland, MSA's coal mine division director, testified before Congress. He stated the explosion was entirely preventable. He presented the dust sample data. He showed ventilation schematics. He detailed the procedural lapses. The record was forensic. The conclusion was clear. Upper Big Branch was not a disaster. It was a crime scene. On November 7, 2014, a federal grand jury indicted Don Blankenship. Blankenship had served as chief executive of Massey Energy from 2000 to 2010. He oversaw operations at Upper Big Branch. He set production targets. He controlled safety budgets, and according to federal prosecutors, he conspired to willfully violate mine health and safety standards. The indictment listed 4 counts: conspiracy to violate federal mine safety laws, making false statements to the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding safety practices, securities fraud, obstruction of justice related to the post-disaster investigation. Prosecutors presented evidence that Blankenship had direct knowledge of safety violations. Internal emails showed he prioritized coal production over compliance. In one message, he instructed managers to run coal, regardless of citations. In another, he dismissed concerns about methane levels as excuses for poor performance. The language was explicit. If any of you have been asked by your group presidents, your supervisors, engineers, or anyone else to do anything other than run coal, Blankenship wrote in a company-wide memo. Another email referenced ventilation issues as just more smoke. The trial began in October 2015. Federal witnesses included former Massey employees, MSHA inspectors, and surviving family members of the deceased miners. The defense argued Blankenship was not directly responsible for operational decisions at Upper Big Branch. They claimed mid-level managers had failed to implement company safety policies. The jury deliberated for 5 days. On December 3, 2015, they returned a verdict. Guilty on 1 count. Conspiracy to willfully violate mine safety standards. Not guilty on the remaining charges, including securities fraud. The conviction carried a maximum sentence of 1 year in prison. On April 6, 2016, 6 years to the day after the explosion, Blankenship was sentenced. 1 year in federal prison, a fine of $250,000. No restitution to the victims' families. The families attended the sentencing hearing. Some wept. Others sat in silence. Gary Quall's father stood and addressed the court. He said his son had been killed by greed. He said the sentence was an insult. Blankenship served 11 months. He was released in May 2017. Massey Energy, as a corporate entity, was never criminally charged. The company was acquired by Alpha Natural Resources in 2011, 3 months before. MSHA's final report was published. The acquisition included an indemnity clause shielding Alpha from Massey's prior liabilities. The forensic record remained. The accountability did not. The Upper Big Branch Miners Memorial stands in Whitesville, West Virginia. It is a simple structure, 29 pillars, each bearing the name of a miner killed on April 5, 2010. Families visit. They leave flowers. They stand in silence. The names are these: Benny Willingham, Josh Napper, Corey Davis, Gary Qualls, Edward Dean Jones, Dillard Earl Persinger, Carl Accord, Jason Whitehead, Gregory Stephen Brock, Dewood Allen Scott, Joe Markham, Ronald Lee Marr, Rex Lynn Mullins, James E. Mooney, Adam Keith Morgan, Richard K. Lane, Nicholas Darrell McCroskey, Timothy Davis, Robert Eugene Clark, Christopher Bell, Howard Dean Payne, Stephen Dale Hensley, William I. Griffith, Joel R. Price, Ricky Workman, Terry Helms, Michael Lee Ellswick, Robert A. Clark. Each man went to work on an ordinary shift, each man expected to return home. In 2021, a pathology study examined lung tissue from the miners who died. The findings were published in the American Journal of Industrial Medicine. 17 of the 24 autopsied miners showed evidence of coal workers' pneumoconiosis, black lung disease, a progressive, irreversible condition caused by prolonged exposure to coal dust. 7 families had consented to donate lung tissue for additional analysis. All 7 showed pneumoconiosis. The study also analyzed respirable dust exposure levels at Upper Big Branch. After adjusting for quartz concentrations, 28% of samples exceeded the US permissible exposure limit. The miners were not just killed by an explosion. They were being killed slowly, shift after shift, by the dust they breathed. This is the final piece of the forensic record. The explosion was preventable. The ventilation failures were documented. The rock dusting violations were cited. The methane accumulation was measured. Every variable that led to the disaster was known, recorded, and ignored. And the men who died were already dying. The memorial in Whitesville is not just a monument to 29 lives lost in an explosion. It is a monument to a system that valued production over people, profit over safety, and corporate survival over human dignity. If you want to understand how regulatory failure, corporate negligence, and systemic indifference converge into preventable tragedy, subscribe to Forensic Protocol, because the scars left behind are deeper than the mine itself.